Okay, we're rolling.
Okay, this is an interview at the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society, Buffalo, New York, 24th of August 2006, approximately 2:20 p.m. The interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
My name is Bruce Alden McCausland. I was born in Buffalo, New York on April 25th, 1959.
Okay. What was your educational background prior to entering the service?
Pretty much public schools. I went to school at Campus School, which is the present location at 1300 Elmwood Avenue on the Buffalo State campus. And it is now a public school. It was a semi-private at the time. And following that, I attended Hutchinson Central Technical High School, which is down on Elmwood Avenue, and my major was computer electronics.
Okay. Obviously you enlisted.
Yes, I enlisted in the Navy.
Why did you enlist and why in the Navy?
Well, there were several reasons. The reason why I enlisted was because I was rather upset by what was going on in the college scene. It seemed to be college was very much a party atmosphere, and I was really not attracted to that sort of mindset or situation. What I wanted to do was I wanted to further my education. I wanted to establish myself financially and also achieve some level of independence. And I looked around at some of the various services and what they had to offer, and the Navy seemed to offer the best programs and the best schools that were available. Plus it would offer all the other incentives and things that I was looking for when I finished high school.
Okay. You enlisted here in Buffalo?
Yes,
Where did you go for your basic?
Great Lakes in Illinois.
Mm-hmm. How long were you there?
I was in boot camp from September through late November, and then I reported to the Naval Training Station side, which was across the road from the boot camp, and I was actually there until July 1978.
Okay, you went into service in 1977.
Yes.
Okay, what, did you have additional training? Is that why you went in?
Well, I had a training in electronics from
Mhm.
high school, and that certainly helped for my naval school.
Mm-hmm.
What it really seemed to do is it helped bring a lot of that education together, going through those schools. The Navy has some very fine schools, and that was one thing I noticed. It seemed to be able to mix everything you need to know down, and there were very little distractions. I really got quite a bit out of it.
Mm-hmm.
What was your MOS?
I was an electronics technician, but following my graduation from A school, I went down to nuclear power school. So I was trained after that in nuclear power. As an electronics technician, I was a reactor operator.
Mm-hmm. Now you went to Knowles?
I went to Knowles Atomic Power Lab,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
prototype training, following my schooling in Orlando, Florida.
Oh, okay, you went to Florida first, then Knowles. Okay. How did you like it at Knowles?
I enjoyed that. A lot of work, it was long hours, but it was just such a beautiful setting down in Saratoga Springs. I actually had a place, a few of us got together and we rented a house in Saratoga Springs, and that was probably some of the most enjoyable years.
Mm-hmm. How long were you there?
About 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have to be tested periodically for radiation exposure?
We were constantly wearing radiation monitoring devices,
Mm-hmm.
and that was checked monthly, and any accumulated dosage was logged, and we were provided with a record of that following our enlistment.
Mm-hmm. Now, what specifically did you learn while you were at Knowles?
Well, at the Knowles plant, what they had were several prototypes of naval reactors. There was the S3G core at the time, which is a submarine core, and pretty much an image of one of the Triton reactor plants and engineering plants. The whole engine room, pretty much, except for the turbines themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And They also had a destroyer, the D-1G, which was a different reactor, and that was in the one giant globe that was there. And they also had a MARF, which was an acronym which I don't remember, MARF, but it was a natural circulation, which I think was a prototype for the Ohio class ballistic submarines. And basically what we learned was operation of the plant. We learned to do maintenance, we learned to do actual reactor startups, shutdowns, operating at power, going through different casualty drills, things of that nature. Things that you might encounter when aboard an operating sub, or even a surface ship, because there were several surface reactors.
In retrospect, after being on a submarine, nuclear submarine, after being at Knowles, how well do you think you were trained?
I think I was trained very well. It was a challenging program. The attrition rate in the program was probably 50% or greater. So they have a lot of time and money invested in you by the end of your training.
Okay. Did you get much time off while you were there? Or did you...
Well, you don't get a whole lot of time off because you're working 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. You might have, for example, 12 on, 12 off, working 7 days, and then you get 2 off, and then work another 7 days and get 3 off, and work another 7 days and get 4 off, and then it's back to 7 on, 2 off.
And so it was pretty demanding.
So it was pretty demanding, but that only got us ready for what it would be really like when we reported aboard ship.
Now, did you have to wear uniforms, naval uniforms?
We wore new uniforms, not so much in the community, but we wore uniforms there.
Okay. Just as you would on a ship?
Just as you would on a ship. Well, you wore dungarees there. On a submarine, you wear what's called a poopy suit, and it's basically a dark blue one-piece suit, zips up at front. I'm sure you're familiar with them from watching some of the various films. And you could either wear that or you could wear your dungarees.
Which did you prefer?
Well, depends upon the time. We wore a little bit of both. The advantage is that if you got to get dressed very quick, that one-piece suit, you just go right on and you're dressed.
Okay.
And the only time we'd wear a dress uniform is if we were coming in and out of port.
What rank did you hold?
I was an electronics technician, 2nd class. I got a nice letter a month or so after I got out of the Navy saying that I actually made 1st class had I stayed in. So I was selected for 1st class, which is E6. But because I left the Navy, I never was awarded that.
All right, following your time at Knowles, where did you go?
Well, after a month's leave, I reported to the USS Boston, SSN 703, which was then an initial manning for the crew. It was a new submarine. It was not even launched yet, still under construction, and it was located at Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut. And my first impression when I saw the size of this thing, we had our offices in a different location. And when I first was taken to see the boat, submarines are called boats instead of ships. It was covered in scaffolding, and it was up, hadn't even hit the water yet. You saw workers all over putting it together, hull patches missing. A submarine is basically broken into 2 major compartments. I mean, if you include the reactor compartment as part of the engineering section. And there is equipment being added to the engineering section, but if you go up forward, you would expect to see a lot of equipment. And at that time, it was empty. The place looked like a dance hall. There was just an empty floor there, an empty deck. And the impression of the size of a submarine, when it's filled with equipment, you don't get the same impression as when you actually walk inside. You know, the only thing you can see are the torpedo tubes, scanning from one end of the bulkhead all the way to the end. And that was really rather impressive, because you feel, or I felt that I was more or less a part of the life, you know, bringing this thing to life And that's an interesting experience. And I'll allude to that a little later in our conversation.
Now, how long you were there before it was launched?
Well, we were launched until April. And even then, when we were launched...
When did you arrive at?
I arrived, I think I actually reported late December, early January. And I don't remember the exact date. But it was the middle of winter.
Mhm.
And it was cold. And you go into the shipyard and you have these different impressions of size and different, there are different smells that you go when you walk into a shipyard. You know, the smell of grinding dust around, and you know, it was a seaside community, so there's a different feel that you get. And that was my first chance to work in a situation like that. And it certainly left an interesting impression. You know, they have huge cranes that are the size of office buildings. And the hull thicknesses on these things are, you know, bigger than the span of my hand, and that's just the thickness of the outer hull.
Mhm.
It was just an incredible experience.
Now, what were your duties while it was under construction?
While it was under construction, being a nuke, as we were referred to, we were the first to man watch. And we actually started manning watch aboard the submarine a month before it was launched. We had testing to do on the reactor plant. We had to accept all the major components. We'd have to make sure they went through a thorough testing. We'd have to look at them. We would have to be able to feel that, is this the equipment that we have that's being turned over for our operation? Is that going to function properly when we finally go to sea? So we had to do a lot of that. We had cold operations testing that we had to run on the reactor plant, test out the equipment.
Now, what do you mean by that?
Well, basically, as you know, a reactor plant runs, it's a very hot
Yes, right.
system, and I'm talking from a temperature
Mhm,
perspective. I can't tell you the temperature because that's classified.
Yes.
But you do testing on that system first at low temperature. Make sure that you don't have any leaks,
Mhm.
for example. I'm simplifying things,
Yes,
of
right,
course.
I realize that.
And following that, then you slowly heat up the system. And you heat up the system using the reactor coolant pumps, because the pumps, because they contain the motors, there's heat generated, and that's enough heat actually to heat the water. And there's also some other components that you can use that can heat the system up to an operating temperature. And then you do another series of testing at the operating temperature. And this is all even before the reactor is installed. Once that's done, the system gets drained, you take the test head off, and they put in the reactor core and buckle it in and tighten it down, do some preliminary testing, and finally weld it on after it's been bolted down, and you begin the whole procedure again. One of the most impressive sights that I happened to be on watch for was the night that they lowered the reactor core into the pressure vessel. And these are the sort of things that you don't normally get to see, because when the reactor is first loaded in, it's loaded in as one piece. The control rods, the fuel assemblies, and everything. And it's really not very radioactive at all,
Mhm.
because it is in its own self-contained shielding, and I can't get any of the design specifications, but it just suffices to say that you see this thing, you might only see in pictures,
Mhm.
and usually only in drawings. And you have it loaded in, and see the empty pressure vessels. Left me with a quite lasting impression. But I'm gotten off on a tangent here.
That's okay.
Once that was done, begin the testing all over again. And you start out with the cold ops testing, a little bit more. You know, you're taking some precautions. At this point, people can still go into the reactor compartment without using any sort of dosimetry, which is what you use to monitor, because the reactor is not yet been critical. And there's really no radiation. Go through the hot ops testing, and you do that. And then once all that's done, and everything's been accepted, and you've proven everything operated properly, then there's another procedure where you go through initial criticality. And that's a long and drawn out procedure. You don't go up at power, but you just bring the reactor to criticality. I should point out that there's something else. The Navy has a very strong program of testing and certifying crews. Now, they could not certify us for an operational reactor safety exam. So what we go through is something different. We went through what's called a reactor safety exam, RSE. And that certifies the crew. Now, keep in mind that we have a lot of very experienced people that have come from other submarines at that same time, along with those who had never been on a ship before. And that would have included me at that time. You go through a very rigorous program of testing, training, they drill you, and they drill you again. You go through this whole evolution. And during a lot of this period, you're on 12-hour shifts, but it's not with a day off. It might be 12 on, 12 off, 12 on, 12 off, and you might do this for months. From the time that we were launched to the time that we finally went critical was well over a year. So that gives you an idea of the amount of testing and the amount of training that was required before they actually allowed us to go critical. I believe that we went critical in July of 1981.
Okay, so were you on board at the launch, or?
Yes, I was on board at the launch. And something I brought here, I meant to bring a picture of the launch itself, but I didn't, is, I don't know if I still have it here. I'm sure I do. This was something that I kept, and that's actually the positions of everybody who stood topside at the time of the launch. The original that I've actually turned over to the USS Boston Shipmates organization. I, for whatever reason, felt that I was compelled to be sort of a historian of sorts while I was there. So if there was something which I thought that might be of value later on, I tried to save that.
I don't know if you can even see that. Your name appears here. This is about where you were standing.
That's about where I was standing. And I'll provide you later on the picture of the launch.
Okay.
Now,
Who christened the?
it was the wife of the then Secretary of the Navy, Hidalgo, I think was his name. I can't remember what his wife's name was. But it was a rather interesting ceremony. Of course, we couldn't see it because we were standing topside. And an interesting point that I didn't know until recently, the fastest submarine actually travels during its life. It can travel well over 40 knots by the time it reaches its terminal velocity going down the ways. And that's about the fastest it's going to travel in its lifetime. Because it can go pretty good clip, not quite at 40 knots, and backwards a tad. So that's a little bit of interesting trivia that I had found out. Now, I was fortunate enough to actually be topside for a second launch. About a year later, the USS City of Corpus Christi was being launched, and it happened to be launched. The scheduled launch was on my birthday, and I had talked to the fellow who was then the chief of the boat on our ship, on the submarine, the Boston, and I mentioned this. I said, "Hey, is there any possibility I could get on the launch of that just my birthday. And he said, well, let me see what I can do. And as it was, they were looking for some more people to man the topside. And because it looks good, however many crew members you have. So I was actually on the launch of that other submarine as well, which was kind of fun.
Yeah.
That's something I sometimes forget to mention.
Now, were you considered what they called on regular ships a plank holder?
I was a plank owner, yes.
Okay.
And I have an interesting story to tell you about that, because by the time that I left the Navy, I went to work in the private sector, actually about another 15, 20 years for the federal government after I left the Navy. And I would say about 1999, 2000 or so, I began to be curious, well, what's happening with the Boston? So I looked it up on the internet and found that it was either just about to be decommissioned, and that there was actually an organization that was members of the crew of several different incarnations of vessels named Boston that had been formed about 1986, 85, 86, thereabouts. And they have a website at www.ussboston.org. And I contacted them and say, I was a member of the crew, and of course they became very interested. And after corresponding for some time on email, I went ahead and I joined the organization, and I sent a lot of the different artifacts that I had saved to that organization. And I've been attending reunions pretty consistently since the first reunion I actually attended was in 2002. But to make a long story short, the USS Boston had been scheduled following its decommission to be dismantled and scrapped. And this organization wanted to save something from the submarine for a memorial display somewhere. They were looking in the Boston area, in New England, or in Groton, somewhere that might be interested in saving the sail for display, or something like that. Well, as you know, we have a naval park here in Buffalo, the Buffalo and Erie County Naval and Military Park. And at that time, I had contacted the director of that park, who was retired Colonel Pat Cunningham. And with the blessings of the organization, the USS Boston Shipmates, I asked if I could contact them and see if we could possibly take that, because they were desperate to be able to save it. He accepted that, providing that we pay the costs. Well, that was accepted, so we started raising the money and managed to raise enough money to have those sections, which was basically, I think the sail itself weighs about 56 tons, and the rudder was another 16 tons. So I think we raised about between $20,000 and $40,000, and got the Navy to ship those pieces here to Buffalo, and they are now at the Buffalo and Erie County Naval Park.
Now, when was it decommissioned?
It was decommissioned in November 19th, 1999, and I think the scrapping was completed in 2003, September 2003. And the sail and rudder, along with some cleats, was actually shipped here to Buffalo, I think July, August, around that period, in 2003. So it's sort of interesting. I've been coordinating that project, trying to get everything taken care of, getting this sail painted and assembled for display. It's interesting. I had this sort of cradle to grave sense of how the submarine stayed in my life.
Mhm.
You know, here it's been 20 years since I've really been aboard, and it's come back into my life. Over the
Now,
last
when
few
was
years.
it launched?
It was launched April 19th, 1980, and it was commissioned January 30th, 1982, and I left the boat following its initial deployment, I think late October, early November 1983. So actually I haven't seen the submarine in about 20 years.
Now, what was life like on board when you were at sea?
Well, that's kind of interesting because I would say that aboard sea you probably get fed some of the better food. I'd say that you have some excellent cooks. Now, after several months of being underway, you go from eating all the fresh foods and vegetables, and eventually you run out of fresh milk, and you run out of fresh eggs, and you start moving to canned foods, and finally the canned foods run out, and you have to eat powdered foods and powdered milk. So after a while it gets a little boring, but you're willing to try different things after reading the same thing for months at sea.
Now, where did you go on the boat?
Well, I actually went around the world on that initial deployment. And that initial deployment was from March through late October, November '83. We spent some time in Diego Garcia, which means that we had to cross the equator. And we went around Africa to get there. And because it's over, Diego Garcia is over the Indian Ocean. And when you cross the equator, you have a ceremony. It's called the shellback initiation. And
Have your card?
you know something? I never got my card.
If you really didn't do it, we don't
I
believe you.
got all the pictures to prove it, though. I got all the pictures to prove it. So, but I do have my flight owner certificate. I have that.
So what was the celebration ceremony?
Well, we had a lot of polywogs on board, that being the first time we crossed. And basically, if I could explain it politely, is you have a shipmate dressed up as Neptune, and his whole court, and you have to bid homage to him, and basically it can get pretty messy because it's an interesting initiation. I don't know whether the Navy today still holds to the same practice with the pressures on hazing and so forth.
Did you have to kiss Neptune's belly?
Yeah, you got to kiss Neptune's belly. I was trying to avoid saying that. Everybody had to do that, yes. And
What's the longest time that you were under?
from the time that I was under to finally seeing sunlight, I think it's about 4.5 months. Yeah, because when we got underway that March, it was April, May, June, July. It was July, I think, when we finally pulled into Diego Garcia. I think that's right. And then we pulled in a couple times after that.
That's a long time to be underwater. Did you feel like going stir crazy, or were there any problems?
You're so busy doing things because you're either on watch, or you're doing maintenance, or you're doing drills. So you're so busy doing that, or you're doing operations, and you have to be quiet. There's a lot of time to read. I brought along several books, and I brought along a whole selection of tapes of music and things I wanted to listen to. And after a while, you share things with other people too. That's when I first became interested in opera. There was one officer aboard who was very interested in that, and he loaned me the libretto and the tapes to La Boheme, so I listened to that underway. A lot of different things you can keep busy with. They did have some exercise machines on board. I think we had a treadmill and a rolling machine. And when you could find time, you got to work out in those. And people were always playing cards. At midnight, they showed movies. There was actually quite a bit to keep you busy. They had a collection of videos that they would take along, so you could watch some pre-recorded shows. And when you pull in a port, they change out all those movies and all those shows, so you could watch some of those. I also took a training course. I was taking various, I think I took an economics course, and economics, and a couple of the other, I can't remember which other courses, there were 2 or 3 courses I took while underway, and I finished those after I got off the boat. And shortly after I got out of the Navy, because of those courses that I took, I ended up earning my associates by doing that.
Now, at that point in time, were there any women on board?
No. No, I still don't think they allow women on board submarines.
Yeah,
They have non-combatant, larger combatant vessels, not submarines. It's just too tight.
can you talk about some of your missions? Were you inside Soviet waters at all, or can't you?
Well, I can't talk about that for 2 reasons. It's probably classified, and I can tell you that while I was on board, we never actually went into any Soviet waters because we were primarily operating in the Indian Ocean.
Okay.
You know, we were trying to track and follow Soviet submarines, but again, I can't talk about that.
Okay. So that was a mission you had, though?
That was part of what we were there for.
Okay.
So it was
Are
very
there
much-
any interesting stories you can tell us that maybe aren't classified?
Well, I can tell you a few interesting stories. You know, a lot of times, I won't say get bored, but to make things interesting, you play some practical jokes on each other. And submariners are famous for the practical jokes they play. There are actually some books that are published that have a number of them. One that I can remember playing was, I was sitting in maneuvering as a reactor operator. And in maneuvering, you basically have 4 different watch stations. You have the reactor operator, whose primary job is to watch the reactor plant. You have the electrical operator, who sits on your right, and you have the throttleman, and over behind you have the engineering officer of the watch. He is the commissioned officer that oversees the other watch stations. And it was a mid-watch, and I think what happened was the electrical operator fell asleep. Now, you're not supposed to do that. He probably could have been put on a report for that. But he was snoring pretty bad, and I was watching my station and also watching his station too, because I was trained as one of the prerequisites as being a reactor operator. You also have to be trained as an electrical operator, and you also have to know the throttleman and be qualified in that watch as well. A lot of cross-training aboard submarines. You not only have to learn to do your job, but you have to learn to do just about everybody else's job. If you don't have the ability to do it, you at least have to know what it is. But he had fallen asleep, so I was watching his panel at the same time. And I forgot how we got along. You know, we refused to wake up. So finally, I take the bottle of white out and I grab that. I open up the white out. He's snoring away, so I paint the bridge of his nose, and he still isn't awake. So I paint his eyelashes, covered with white out. Paint little swirlies on his glasses. I got his mustache real good. I even got around his ears covered with white out.
This guy must have been really out.
He was really out of it. And, you know, sometimes he started a little bit. Meanwhile, everybody else was just breaking up, you know, just trying to hold back their laughs. They were laughing so hard. Finally, the guy woke up. He was just so pissed off. He walked out. We didn't we had to wait somebody else to replace him. So.
Now, as a reactor operator, when you're watching the screens and so on, what are you specifically watching and looking for?
You're watching to make sure that the temperature stays in the specified band. You're making sure that the reactor power doesn't exceed certain limits. You're watching pressures, temperatures. You're watching for any unusual conditions that occur. You're watching for the conditions of the reactor coolant pumps, pressurizer water levels, things like that. So it's temperatures, levels, nuclear instrumentation, making sure they'll stay within the normal ranges. And when you go up or down belts, that's when those things are going to change mostly.
Did you have any emergency situations at all?
No, other than those that were casualty situations that were for drills, I did not have any.
Mm-hmm.
When I was on watch one time when the reactor was shut down, I was on watch as the shutdown reactor operator. And at that time, when you were in a shutdown condition, you try to reduce the number of watch standards to as minimum as possible. So on watch, you had a reactor operator, you have an engineering watch supervisor who doesn't always have to be there, and you have a roving watch, and occasionally you have an auxiliary electrician or a shutdown electrical operator, as you call it.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't always have to be stationed unless there are certain evolutions taking place at the electric plant. During one of those occasions, we did lose shore power. So what I had to do is I had to jump over to the electric plant, and I had to put the plant in a safe condition and order that we rig ship for reduced electrical, and basically run the entire system off the battery until shore power came back. So that was the only real casualty that I had when I was on watch. I mean, sometimes you might have something where you're doing a special evolution and you might have a pressure relief valve lift. I think that happened to me. I had like a 4,000-pound relief valve lift inches, well not inches, maybe a foot or so from my ear. And, you know, when something like it's like a gun going off,
Mm-hmm.
goes and that caused me to jump. So other than that, the only other time where I had something unusual happen is I was running some testing on a piece of equipment. They had these huge capacitors. They had to do with the reactor coolant pumps, and we were still in the shipyard at the time. And one of the commissioned officers, who was the I can't remember his name, Lieutenant One Casey, I think was his name. But he had walked by, and for whatever reason, I was running a test, and this capacitor decided to explode. It literally exploded, and this capacitor was filled with all this dielectric, which is basically thin paper, and the whole thing went pop, and all this paper came out of this machinery. And this guy, who was the on duty at the time, he must have jumped about 3 feet in the air. He was a short guy, and he just jumped 3 feet. It was the funniest thing, other than the shock of that happening. Everybody around who had seen that was laughing so hard just to see this guy try to jump up, and you know, he was running around like he just didn't quite know what to do. And I think after that point, he sort of earned a nickname, sort of like. I guess they decided to call him a ferret or something like that. You know, his nickname was the Ferret. So.
Did you read the book Blind Man's Bluff?
No, I haven't yet. That's one that I mean to read.
I'm going to ask you how authentic you thought it was.
Yeah, I got to do that. I think the only one I read is The Hunt for Red October.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes place, of course, aboard the USS Dallas, the SSN 700, which was being built around the same time that we were, around the same time as Boston. So I knew a number of people who were actually on board the Dallas as well, like owners.
Now, when did you leave service?
I got out in November '83.
Okay.
I actually extended because after we visited Diego Garcia, we stopped over and visited Australia. So we stopped over for a period of time, several days in Perth. We pulled into Fremantle, which is over on the west coast. Beautiful place. Really enjoyed that. And then we traveled to Hobart, Tasmania, one of the offshore islands, one of the states of Australia. And that was a lot of fun too. Perth and Fremantle and Perth reminded me a lot of what California was like. And I'd say that Hobart, Tasmania felt more like the northeast sort of city. Very British, very nice.
How do you think your time in the service had an effect on your life?
Well, I think it had a very positive impression on my life. It certainly helped hone some of my organizational skills. I felt that it was a lot of work, and it wasn't something that I could have done or would have wanted to do until the point where I had reached retirement. It being my first boat, it was probably a lot more work for me. Had I stayed in, it would have gotten easier, I'm sure. And I've since reestablished contact with a lot of people that did in fact stay in. And one thing I have to mention is that you become very close to people when you're on board in a situation.
That was going to be a follow-up question if you stayed in contact.
Yeah, you become very much like brothers. You're like a family. And I would say that one of the greatest coping skills that I learned was dealing with people.
Were there ever any problems?
Sometimes you get some friction, but you always find a way to resolve that friction. You have to, because you can avoid people sometimes, but on a submarine, you can't do that all the time.
How many on board?
We were generally about 115, 120 people on board. More when you were doing sea trials. And when you were doing sea trials, a lot of times what you had to do is you had a hot bunk. And that's literally where you have 2 or 3 people sharing one bunk. Or it might be, if you're lucky, 3 people sharing 2 bunks. Basically, as soon as somebody gets off watch, that person gets out of the rack, goes on watch, and you get in. And that's your time to sleep. And they call it hot bunking because a lot of times that rack is still warm by the time you get back in and off watch.
Did you ever have any CIA people that you knew of on board?
My most interesting experience was during our initial sea trials. We were the last boat to host Admiral Rickover. Admiral Hyman Rickover, who was really the father of the nuclear power program. And he had a policy that every alpha trial that a submarine went on, he was aboard. And after we returned to port, he was met on the pier and he was told that he's going to be retiring. That's when Reagan forced him to retire. So that was in 1982.
Okay, you have some photographs to show us.
I have some photographs.
If you just hold them up like this in front of you, Wayne can focus on each one and maybe tell us about them.
Now the first one I'm going to show you, this is a composite that I made up. And here we have a picture of the submarine when it was underway. Actually, I think we're actually pulled into Diego Garcia. And as you can tell, it has all the equipment. You can see the bow just forward of this ensign there. You get a good picture of that?
No, that's the sail, right?
That's the sail. That's a picture from the sail.
Mhm.
And here's a picture taken from the same view. This is the Buffalo Naval Park.
Oh, okay.
So you get a sort of now and then comparison. One is 1983, and this one is taken 1985. I took that about a year ago.
Okay.
Now here's a picture underway, and there I am. I'm leaning against this front area where there normally would be. When you're underway on the surface, they put up a plexiglass piece, which you can barely see. I have my arm on, and that's in the front here. And this is Lieutenant Jones, it's the fellow I had mentioned who loaned me the La Boheme tapes. And this is Lieutenant Dimitri, I believe his name was.
Okay.
Okay. I also made a composite here. Again, this is a picture of the submarine down below as it appeared when going through the Panama Canal in 1983. I didn't take this one, somebody sent me this picture.
Okay.
And this is approximately the same view of the sail as it appears at the Buffalo Naval Park. Now we still have to manufacture the plates that are missing. As you can see, there are holes in the sail. When they decided to scrap the submarine, the first thing they do is they take off all the sail plates because there's a lot of components that are inside the sail. It's not just empty.
Mm-hmm.
And the shipyard, for whatever reason, rather than saving them, threw them out. So we have to get those remade. Now I also have here a picture that was taken. This is a stereo picture. And this was taken in Tasmania. And I have an old realist stereo camera. I'm not sure how many people actually are still taking stereo pictures, but that had been a hobby of mine for about 30 years, since the mid-70s. And I carried that with me during this deployment. And I have a number of stereo views that I took. And each is a right and left image taken from different lenses. And if you're familiar with the stereo opticon that your parents or grandparents may have had, where you, where you look through
It
and
becomes
you get
3-dimensional.
3D, that'll give you that three-dimensional effect. And this is just some other duplicates that I brought if you wanted.
Yes, I'd like to put them in the folder.
So you're welcome to all these that I have here.
All right, well, thank you very much for your interview. That was very interesting.
No, you're welcome.